quick announcements. Don't forget to take the vocab quiz this weekend. Now, you are at the point where, you know, if, say, you've got all 100s on the vocab quizzes thus far, at this point you're just going to be replacing old grades, right? So the next 3 vocab quizzes, right, if you get a good grade, it's just going to replace bad grades on the previous quizzes. However, you should still probably pay attention to this because these terms will still show up on the exam. Also, next week I will give everybody sample essay questions to help you study for the final. Oh, that reminds me too. I don't think we have one officially scheduled for this course, but if y'all would like to do a review session before the final exam, I'm happy to schedule that with you. We'll just, think about a time around the end of the term before the exam when we're all free, and we'll see if we can get that arranged. What else? Oh, other big thing. I've decided to give you an extra week to do the annotated bibliography. So that'll be due now on the 22nd, right? Not tomorrow. Yes?
And the proposal will also be due that day?
No, the proposal, we'll push the proposal back too. So why don't we say then we'll push the proposal forward to Wednesday of the following week. So you'll have a couple extra days to work on that as well. Mm-hmm. And for Tuesday, you're just going to read those Auden poems and the essay. And yeah, the titles of these poems look really, really long. That's because Auden didn't give his early poems titles. So the convention has been to title them just by quoting the first line. But yeah, they're all in the English Auden. All easily accessible, so yeah. Anybody have any questions about it? Before we get back to Orwell. That's enough? Okay. So, on Tuesday, Nick gave us a rundown of much of what was going on in the first half of the book, or at least like a lot of the issues that Orwell was trying to address in the first half of the book. What did y'all think of this second half? And those of you who weren't here, if you have things you'd like to say about the first half as well, please do feel free to offer. What did y'all think about this?
Transformative on his side.
Okay. What do you mean by transformative? What's transformative?
Just to go from this middle class snobby kid to a more accepting person.
Okay. And yeah, let's actually kind of push on this idea of class here a little bit, because I think it's pretty central.
He has that classic archetype of the kid who had like the real conservative parents, and then he went to college.
Except Orwell actually didn't go to college.
Right.
Well, he went to college, and then he went to Eton College, which is like an elite preparatory school. But then he didn't go to university. Instead of going to university, he actually enrolled in the colonial service and was a policeman in Burma for a few years. So a lot of his education really took place in that kind of colonial context. This was kind of like really where he came to be more aware of the wider world around him. And then when he came back, he spent a couple of years basically living as a tramp in London and in Paris. And wrote a book about those experiences called Down and Out in London and Paris. And I think he credits a lot of that with breaking down a lot of his own class prejudices, right? But did you note which class he claims to belong to himself? Like, what's the term he uses for the class he himself belongs to?
Lower upper middle.
Yeah, the lower upper middle class, right? What does he mean by this?
class of people that are trying to act middle, but they still struggle with their bills a little bit, not by a lot.
Yeah. So let's look at the range of incomes, right, that he notes people belonging to this class as having, right? So he says from, on page 122, so between 2,000 pounds and 300 pounds a year. I'm not good at drawing a little poundy symbol, but. So 2,000 pounds would be, in today's dollars, about $190,000 a year. 300 pounds a year would be about $28,500 a year. Now, would we could, yeah, go ahead.
Is that especially 300 or 3,000?
300.
Okay.
So this is an enormous range, right? And he's claiming that his family was at the lower end of this. So what was it that made them upper middle class if it wasn't money?
Appearance?
Yeah, appearance, right? Right? The way you dress, the way you groom yourself, right? What else would make them upper middle class rather than working class?
The people that I know, like the people they socialize.
Okay, social connections, yeah. And what else does he mention in terms of these kind of sets of class values that make people, that, you know, something that makes people recognizable as belonging to a particular class?
Your job occupation.
Okay, occupation. There are certain occupations that,
Like the way you talk.
yeah, language is an enormous part of this as well, right? Did you notice that there's a particular letter he keeps harping on? Yeah, basically like whether you are middle class or working class, like one way to recognize this is whether you pronounce H's or not. Right? People who don't pronounce their H's are usually working class. People who make a point of pronouncing their H's tend to be from the upper classes, right? So yeah, language and accent are a huge part of this. And money, not so much, right? Because like, would we even consider, you know, in today's dollars, you know, $28,500 a middle class salary? Kind of just, maybe just barely, right? This is, you know, particularly, you know, not much money for a family to live on. So the lower upper middle class, these are people who are upper middle class by tradition and culture, right? Not by income. And what is the biggest obstacle for Orwell? Or what is the biggest obstacle he cites for someone from the lower upper middle class in making connections with the working class?
They can sometimes come across as unsympathetic.
Okay. How so? Can you give me an example? And if anybody else has anything else to throw out there.
I
mean, wasn't it because they were basically taught that the lower class wasn't good?
What's that?
Weren't they like basically taught that the lower class was bad?
I think that's part of it's a matter of education here. If you look at maybe like page 125, 126, right? We get this explanation as to why his parents didn't want him associating with working class people after a certain age, right?
They didn't want him to pick up the accent.
Yeah, they didn't want him to pick up the accent, right? The bottom of the page here, it says, right, this was snobbish, if you like, but it was also necessary, for middle-class people cannot afford to let their children grow up with vulgar accents. Let's try to unpack this language here a little bit, right? Middle-class people cannot afford to let their children grow up with vulgar accents. What's weird about that sentence, or interesting about that sentence?
It insinuates that money is involved and that having an accent will lead to a loss of income or loss of something status.
Okay, yeah, and if your family is barely hanging on to your middle class status as it is, right?
It would be a loss of social currency.
Yes, very good. It would make you downwardly mobile, right? So you remember how we've talked in the past about, these fears of devolution, right? That, once Darwin's theory of evolution became widely accepted among biologists, it led to a fear that if people could evolve, they could also devolve, right? You could go backwards into more primitive states. And I think that there's an economic version of this that Orwell is describing as well, that happens among middle class people, particularly those who are just at the bottom of the upper middle class, and are really kind of only there through tradition rather than actual prestige or income, right? So they cannot afford to let their children grow up with vulgar
It
accents.
kind of reminds me of something I read for high school.
Okay.
I think it was My Fair Lady or something like that. A guy takes on a bet that he can take a woman from the lower class street selling flowers on the side of the road with an awful accent and appearance, and within a certain amount of time turn her into someone that they think is royalty.
Okay, yeah, so I think there's a musical called My Fair Lady. I think it's a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical from the 40s, but it's based on a George Bernard Shaw play called Pygmalion.
That's it.
It's the same plot but with no singing and dancing, right? And yeah, so the basic argument that Shaw is making in that play is that class is entirely a matter of perception, right? And that it doesn't matter what Eliza Doolittle's actual class origins are, right? Once Henry Higgins takes her in hand, dresses her properly, and teaches her to pronounce her H's.
I think the speech was something that we focused on a lot in that class.
Yeah.
The emphasis on how to properly pronounce things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, like the whole idea of proper pronunciation and proper grammar do have like a strong kind of class dimension, right? What we consider proper, what we consider correct, is usually simply what's preferred by the upper classes in the society, right? There's, for example, the sentences that, okay, let me just back up here for a second. A grammatical English sentence is really just a sentence that another speaker of English is able to interpret correctly, right? But we have all of these style rules that have come down to us from the 18th century that are the result of people trying to make English more like Latin, right? So an educated way of writing or of speaking tends to follow all of these rules that normal people usually don't follow in speech, right? So yeah, there's that class dimension to language. And I think where I want to look at the way he follows this up as well, and kind of like what the middle class perception of the working class person becomes as a result of this, right? So very early, the working class ceased to be a race of friendly and wonderful beings and became a race of enemies. We realized that they hated us, but we could never understand why. And naturally, we set it down to pure, vicious malignity. To me, in my early boyhood, to nearly all children of families like mine, common people seemed almost subhuman. They had coarse faces, hideous accents, and gross manners. They hated everyone who was not like themselves. And if they got half a chance, they would insult you in brutal ways. That was our view of them, and though it was false, it was understandable. Now, if you see anything ironic in the way the middle class conceives of the working class here?
It's almost like a transference type deal. They're transferring how they view the working class and basically trying to get around so they're like, oh, we don't see them that way, but that's how they see us.
Uh-huh.
In reality, that's how the middle class sees the working class.
Yeah, they hate us and think we're a bunch of stuck-up dicks. Right? So we're going to insult them before they can insult us. And so yeah, there's this need to differentiate, right? This need to stratify. And I think that one thing that Orwell argues middle-class socialists tend to ignore is people's kind of like natural feelings for the class they were born in, right? And the way we're conditioned by our class background. And there's another dimension to this as well at the bottom of page 127. And this, I think, is the thing that he actually regards as the biggest barrier to middle-class association with the working classes. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Do y'all recognize the sentence I'm talking about here? Yeah. He makes a lot of noise through the whole book about smells, right? Smells are all over the place. Right. But there was another and more serious difficulty. Here you come to the real secret of class distinction in the West. The real reason why a European of bourgeois upbringing, even when he calls himself a communist, cannot without a hard effort think of a working man as his equal. It is summed up in 4 frightful words which people nowadays are chary of uttering, but which were bandied about quite freely in my childhood. Those words were, the lower classes smell. Now, what does he tend to use smell as a kind of shorthand for? What kinds of ideas does he associate with smell?
I know down in the mines you kept talking about the smell.
Okay.
When he was in his lodgings,
Uh-huh.
that was also a smell.
Yeah. And let's kind of maybe go back to chapter 1 there and think about that because I think that'll give us a good sense of what's going on, the kind of smells that he notes in the Brookers' boarding house. And let's see, where... And smell notwithstanding, do you recognize a particular pattern in the way he describes the overall conditions of the Brookers' house?
Messy, disgusting,
Yeah, messy would probably be an understatement, right? How would we amp that up?
Ludicrously messy.
Okay.
It's a hodgepodge.
But like when we think of messy, right, we just kind of think of disorderly, right? But what he's complaining about here is not so much mess as like filth, right? This place isn't just messy, it's dirty. Right? He talks about Mr. Brooker, walking around with his thumb in the chamber pot while he's going to empty it, right? And then cutting people slices of bread and leaving a big thumbprint in it. Right? He talks about bugs and parasites. Right, about the sticky marmalade jar. About the bits of newspaper that Mrs. Brooker uses to wipe her mouth and just leaves lying around, right? So, yeah, smell here is really a kind of code word for middle class ideas of hygiene, right? When he talks about the middle class idea being that the lower classes smell, it's code for that the lower classes are dirty. They're unhygienic. Right, page 128, right? That was what we were taught. The lower classes smell. And here, obviously, you are at an impassable barrier. For no feeling of like or dislike is quite so fundamental as a physical feeling. Race hatred, religious hatred, differences of education, of temperament, of intellect, even differences of moral code can be got over, but physical repulsion cannot. You can have affection for a murderer or a sodomite, but you cannot have an affection for a man whose breath stinks, habitually stinks, I mean. However well you may wish him, however much you may admire his mind and character, if his breath stinks, he is horrible, and in your heart of hearts you will hate him. It may not greatly matter if the average middle-class person is brought up to believe that the working classes are ignorant, lazy, drunken, boorish, and dishonest. It is when he is brought up to believe that they are dirty that the harm is done. So, what's the barrier here then that he's describing with the whole dirt and smell thing?
You can't look past it.
Yeah, that this is something like when you have like a gut level physical reaction to someone who simply repulses you, right? When you think of someone as not, maybe like not just unattractive, but gross, right, but disgusting, that's something that you have a hard time getting over. So this is the middle class attitude towards the working class. Now, how does he flip this around in describing working class attitudes towards middle class socialists? Why do the working classes not like middle class socialists?
Because they can come across as unsympathetic.
What makes them unsympathetic, though? Like,
Their tradition and culture that they were raised in. Regardless of if you believe something or not, your base instinct is to go back to what you were raised to believe. The habits and traditions that were instilled into you from the time you were born. So even if you don't intend to come across as, if you walk up to somebody and they smell bad, but you want to like that person, be nice to that person, you're going to try and pretend that it doesn't bother you, but you can't stop that jerk instinct to, crinkle your nose.
Right. You can't stop the little.
That's why I believe a lot of times back then they would carry, especially men, would carry like a little bundle of flowers in the pocket of their jacket to put under their nose when they would smell something bad.
Yeah, that was especially common among French aristocrats of the 18th century before the revolutionaries got them and chopped all their heads off. But I think like there is something more specific though a more specific point that he makes about these middle-class socialists that I think has to do with this physical revulsion, right? So the middle classes are physically revolted by the working classes, right? And I want to point to the scene in which he sees the two socialist men on the bus. And now, of course, that I'm looking for it, I can't find it, right? Page 174. Can I get somebody to start reading for us from the top of the page there? In addition to this, there is the horrible, the really disquieting.
In addition to this, there is the horrible, the really disquieting prevalence of cranks wherever socialists are gathered together. One sometimes gets the impression that the mere words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure, quack, pacifist, and feminist in England.
Okay, so let's pause here for a second, right? Like, maybe, like, so we see that Orwell maybe takes a rather dim view of feminism, right? But otherwise, what is the argument here he's making about the kinds of people who are drawn to socialism openly?
They're all
They're
weird.
hipsters.
Yeah.
Yeah, it draws cranks, it draws weirdos, right? It draws people who society perceives as abnormal. All right, if you could continue, please.
Okay, one day this summer, I was riding through Letchworth when the bus stopped and two dreadful-looking old men got onto it. They were both about 60, both very short, pink and chubby, and both hatless. One of them was obscenely bald, the other had long gray hair, bobbed in the Lloyd George style. They were dressed in pistachio-colored shirts and khaki shorts, into which their huge bottoms were crammed so tightly that you could study every dimple. Their appearance created a mild stir of horror on top of the bus.
Okay, thank you, right? So again, like, what causes the other passengers on the bus to be revolted by these two old men?
Their shorts are too tight.
Okay, they're two old fat guys wearing tight shorts, yeah.
And they don't have hats.
Yep, they're not wearing hats. One of them is obscenely bald, right? But the basic point here, right, is that like these socialists are perceived as ugly, right? So the revulsion he's describing here that people feel at them is a physical revulsion.
Right, that's what I wrote about in our quiz. I talked about
Uh-huh.
how like people don't take them seriously because they look like that and do stuff. It's not like the norm. Like it's not like normal to be like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the way again, yeah, that he thinks that it draws people whom society regards as weirdos, right? Now, not all outsiders for Orwell are bad in this way, right? So he talks kind of favorably about tramps. And tramps are also basically abnormal, right? But why is it easier, according to Orwell, to hang out with tramps than it is to hang out if you're a middle-class person with the working classes? Let's go to page 154 here. Can I get somebody to start reading for us near the beginning of chapter 10 here, Tramps, Beggars, Criminals, and Social Outcasts.
Tramps, beggars, criminals, and social outcasts generally are very exceptional beings and no more typical of the working class as a whole than, say, the literary intelligentsia are typical of the bourgeoisie. It is quite easy to be on terms of intimacy with a foreign intellectual, but it is not at all easy to be on terms of intimacy with an ordinary, respectable foreigner of the middle class. How many Englishmen have seen the inside of an ordinary French bourgeois family, for instance? Probably it would be quite impossible to do, so short of marrying into it. And it is rather similar with the English working class. Nothing is easier than to be bosom pals with a pickpocket, if you know where to look for them. But it is very difficult to be bosom pals with a bricklayer.
Okay, thank you. So why is it easier to make friends with a pickpocket than to make friends with a bricklayer if you don't belong to the same class?
They're more approachable.
The pickpocket will probably approach you, right, if you're not looking.
They're more savvy. They have a more developed way of speaking and manipulating.
Mhm. Okay. What else is different about them what else is different about a pickpocket from other members of his class?
You never see a pickpocket coming.
You never know. Or at least if he's any good, you don't, right? But he's also not typical, right? He's not ordinary. Right, the members of the criminal classes or of the kind of down on their luck living out of doors classes, right, are not typical representatives of the working class. Indeed, as he goes on to note here, like, not all tramps actually have their origins in the working class either. If we look on page 155 here, right, again, tramps come from all parts of the British Isles, and the variation in English accents is enormous. A tramp is used to hearing all kinds of accents among his mates, some of them so strange to him that he can hardly understand them. And a man from Cardiff, say Cardiff or Durham or Dublin, does not necessarily know which of the South English accents is an educated one. In any case, men with educated accents, though rare among tramps, are not unknown. But even when tramps are aware that you are of different origin from themselves, it does not necessarily alter their attitude. From their point of view, all that matters is you, like themselves, are on the bone. And in that world, it is not done to ask too many questions. So if you are a tramp, what matters more to other tramps? Your present or your past?
Present.
Yeah. The past, fine if you want to talk about it, right? But no one is going to read too much into it, hold it against you, or even ask questions, right? So the tramp is an outcast, and is an outcast who kind of lives, according to Orwell here, in the present, right? You're just kind of going from meal to meal. Now, why do you think the members of the Left Book Club, even though they did go ahead and publish this, right? Why do you think they objected to this?
They're probably mostly cranks.
Okay, maybe they're cranks themselves, right? It might also be good for us, for those of you who weren't here on Tuesday, to just review for a second what the Left Book Club was. Do you all remember? Nick, Sam, can you help me out with this?
It was like this monthly book club kind of deal where they would see a book, and
Yep.
a lot of it was basically like, I don't want to say like propaganda, but a lot of it was like political issues.
Yeah,
They sent you selected readings.
Yeah, it was selected readings with a left-wing political focus, right? Yes.
I said they were all tramps. Probably a big part of their audience is not tramps, cranks. Their audience could be a lot of cranks.
Oh, sure. Although, like, one thing to remember, again, that the Left Book Club, like, the subscription was relatively inexpensive. And at its height, it had about 60,000 members. So this was not a tiny organization.
So someone in the working class could feasibly earn enough money to say, if they really, really wanted to, could get a subscription.
Yeah, if they had the interest, yeah. I mean, I think that was part of the point, was to make it cheap so that, people of modest means could subscribe. But yeah, a lot of what they objected to was the depiction of socialists as cranks or as weirdos, right? Even though, a lot of what Orwell's doing, right, he's not trying to knock the idea itself. What he's trying to knock is the way people go about trying to gain converts, right? It's, you're not going to, walk into a pub in Birmingham and start talking to, steel workers about, Marxist dialectics and permanent revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat and actually have them follow you, right? Especially if you're a little man with a bald head trying to cram your fat ass into a pair of khaki shorts, right? He makes a lot about this, a lot of the, socialists seem to want to make the world safe for little fat men, right? So he seems to associate the middle class socialist also with kind of softness and weakness.
They didn't like his book, or they didn't like this text because he made them sound like something they didn't want to be described as. They didn't like the way that he made them sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, really, who would, right? Who would want to be described as a crank? But on top of this, there's a bigger, there's a bigger dispute playing out across Western and Central Europe, and Eastern Europe as well, with the rise of the Soviet Union, between rival economic systems, right? So for the 19th century, across Europe, the dominant systems were a kind of fusion of capitalism and feudalism, right? So you had, relatively free trade, low taxes, deregulated markets, not a lot of rules governing industry, but the money was typically flowing into the hands of a small oligarchy in a lot of countries. And by the end of the 19th century, right, the rival system of socialism is making a lot of headway against this capitalist feudalist system, right? This idea that the workers should own the means of production for themselves rather than being paid to work at a machine that someone else owns. And after World War I, hyper-nationalist, hyper-hierarchical fascism is also being looked at as a viable system of economics and politics. Fascists take over Italy, they take over Germany, although they managed to do so at least initially in free and fair elections. And there's an attempted fascist takeover going on in Spain at the time Orwell is writing this. More on that in a second, right? But yeah, there's a lot of conflict between socialists and fascists, even on the street level, in Britain in the 30s. We talked a little bit last time about the Battle of Cable Street. Sam and Nick, do you remember what this was?
That was a socialist march that was being protected by an absurd amount of police and then an even more absurd amount of right-wing opposites were, I believe the figure was 6,000 police was guarding 3,000 socialists.
Yeah.
And on the outside, there's 100,000 conservatives that want to beat them up.
You've got the basic model right there, but you've reversed the political polarity, yeah.
Because wasn't it fascists marching through the Jewish
Yes. That's exactly, yeah, you had, it was the British Union of Fascists. Led by a guy named Sir Oswald Mosley, who had originally been a left-wing politician, and then adopts a kind of militaristic, hyper-nationalist stance, and seems to enjoy marching about in uniform with a bunch of other people marching around in uniforms behind him. So yeah, the Battle of Cable Street. So Cable Street is in East London. In a heavily Jewish neighborhood. So these fascist movements, like the British Union of Fascists, often blamed groups they regarded as outsiders, like Jews, for the economic problems of the unemployed in the 20s and 30s, right? This is the other thing that we have to recognize, like what's going on worldwide in the 1930s.
Hitler.
Hitler's what's happening in Germany in the 1930s, right?
Depression.
But yes, exactly, the Great Depression, which in Britain is referred to as the Great Slump. So if you see people referencing the slump or the depression, they're talking about the same thing. But yeah, this Battle of Cable Street, this was on October 4th, 1936. So as Orwell is actually finishing up the book. And yeah, as Nick said, you've got 3,000 fascists and 6,000 police who are chased out of East London by about 100,000 anti-fascists. Trade unions, members of the local Jewish community, socialist groups, and just people who didn't like fascists generally. What's that? Yeah, well, I think they certainly picked the wrong neighborhood to do their little triumphalist march in. Now, at the same, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes, they're matching bridges. Yes, they're all wearing matching bridges.
It's like the shirt brigade.
The what?
All the people who went by like blue shirts, brown shirts, like I just call them the shirt brigades.
Oh, the shirt brigade. Okay, yeah. I forget what color the British Union of Fascists were. Because in Germany there were brown shirts. In Italy there were black shirts. In Ireland there were the blue shirts. And I know that the British Union of Fascists had a color, but I can't
We're a
recall.
bunch of elementary school children getting ready for field day.
Yeah, if those elementary school children were armed and angry. What else was okay, other contextual bits here, right, to throw in. So you also had mass unemployment, particularly in the north of England, right? As Nick noted last time, about 70% of people were unemployed in some areas. So huge unemployment figures. And the government wasn't really doing much about it, in part because they feared communist involvement in some of the anti-unemployment movements, right? So for example, there was an event also in October of 1936 called the Jarrow Crusade. So Jarrow is a town in kind of the extreme north of England. And historically, Jarrow was a shipbuilding center. But in 1934, the big shipyard closed and put most of the town's working age population on the dole. There wasn't really any comparable local industry. So starting on the 5th of October in 1936, 200 men from Jarrow begin to march on foot to the Houses of Parliament in Westminster to deliver a petition for relief. So from Jarrow to London is a distance of about 300 miles. So as you can see, it takes them the better part of a month to make this trip. But then because Parliament suspected communist involvement, even though this was actually something that the Jarrow City Council had kind of come up with on its own, the government refused to do anything about this, and they kept the marchers at arm's length. And so while this was a really very publicly visible anti-unemployment crusade, there was little, apart from building up a lot of public sympathy for the unemployed, there was very little practical results. But it also played into a kind of general romanticization of workers that you see on the 1930s left. So, for example, the poet Cecil Day Lewis in a poem called On a Communist, writes the lines, why is it that we all, upon seeing a communist, feel small? And there's this tendency to describe working men, and communist or socialist working men in particular, as these kind of Nietzschean supermen, right? In fact, there's a guy by the name of John Grierson. He's a Scottish filmmaker who gets himself a job in the new film unit of the GPO, that's the General Post Office. So the Post Office is actually kind of funding these documentary films that people like Grierson are making. And Grierson makes two very well-known films, both of which are about, basically about the working classes, right? So the first is called Coalface in 1935. And the second is called Night Mail. And that's released in 1936. And both of these feature scripts written and read by W.H. Auden, who we'll be reading next week. So essentially what Auden does here, it's not really a script in the conventional sense, right? He writes a poem to accompany the film and reads it aloud while the images kind of run before you. But the Grierson image of the working class is like a hardened noble striver, right? And this is the basic idea that much leftist art in the 30s is trying to convey. Now then, let's compare this to Orwell's idea of the socialist. Does Orwell agree that this, noble, strong worker is what the socialist actually looks like?
Not really.
Yeah. The socialist Orwell describes as a sandal-wearing fat nudist, right? Unattractive weirdos. And so one of the reasons the Left Book Club objects so strenuously to Orwell's depiction of socialists is because it's so much at odds with this image they've been trying to build up, right? No, it's not little fat men. We're not making the world safe for little fat men. We're making the world safe for these guys who dig coal, right? We're making the world safe for these guys who will run the train through the night to make sure that the mail gets through and all that sort of thing. And Orwell is kind of shaking his head and saying, no, that's really not who your audience is here. That's not what your plans are actually likely to accomplish. And I think some of this also has to do with the way he describes the role of automation and technology in human life in the early 20th century. So have any of you ever heard the phrase before, fully automated luxury communism? I think that there are various Facebook groups and Twitter pages that are devoted to it, right? But can you kind of ascertain what the basic idea would be? If I offered you fully automated luxury communism, what am I offering you?
Machines taking over.
Machines taking over what exactly?
Like jobs and, what was it again? Fully automated.
Fully automated luxury communism, yep.
There's no need for physical labor because machines do all the work.
Basically, yes. So you then are free to do whatever, right? Machines produce enough for everybody, so there's no need for anyone to have private property anymore, and there's no need for anyone to lord their status over anybody else, and there's no need for anybody to work anymore. This is actually an idea that is first proposed, as far as I can tell, by Oscar Wilde in the 1890s. So Wilde wrote an essay called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. That made two important arguments, right? One had to do with class antagonism. That the upper classes hate the lower classes for being dependent on them for philanthropy. And that the lower classes hate the upper classes because they hate being dependent on them for philanthropy, for handouts, right? So one of the things he proposes is the elimination of philanthropy, right? Because it just makes people hate each other. The other thing he suggests is that the economy be fully automated, that people own that the people of the nation own the machines in common, and socialism. And that if all of our needs are produced by machines, there's no need for any of us to work, and we can thus just kind of develop the faculties of our minds, right? And we can enjoy artistic pursuits. Right? So he imagines this kind of utopia where this frees people of all classes to pursue their own intellectual passions, right? That this will actually lead to the greater intellectual and spiritual development of everyone, since nobody has to go down into a coal mine anymore. So the usual argument for automation from a socialist perspective that Orwell cites here comes from that tradition, right? That the more we automate, the less individuals will have to work. Now the problem with that is, again, for Orwell, who does that then make the world safe for? If there's no danger or challenge left for human beings, then what happens to us?
We become fat men.
Yes. It just makes the world safe for little fat men, right?
Yes.
And there's a passage here too I just want to quickly cite where he talks about how even people who think they're roughing it are still completely dependent on machine society. It is, and of course now I can't find it. Because thing wanted always buried. Anyway, yeah, he's talking about people who think they can step out of the usual dependence on machines, like oh, here we go, page 218. Right, the distaste for progress and machine civilization, which is so common among sensitive people, is only defensible as an attitude of mind. It is not valid as a reason for rejecting socialism because it presupposes an alternative which does not exist. When you say, I object to mechanization and standardization, therefore I object to socialism, you are saying in effect, I am free to do without the machine if I choose, which is nonsense. We are all dependent upon the machine, and if the machine stopped working, most of us would die. You may hate the machine civilization, probably you are right to hate it, but for the present there can be no question of accepting or rejecting it. The machine civilization is here, and it can only be criticized from the inside because all of us are inside of it. It is only romantic fools who flatter themselves that they have escaped, like the literary gent in his Tudor cottage with bathroom hot and cold, and the he-man who goes off to live a primitive life in the jungle, with a Mannlicher rifle and 4 wagon loads of tinned food. So even people who think they're roughing it, right, are still dependent in some way on mechanized civilization.
It's like going camping in a camper.
Yeah, and nothing wrong with that, right?
No.
Yeah.
But you can't say you're roughing it if you're in a camper.
I don't know, having the toilet in the shower, I mean, that's, that's roughing it, right? It's, at least like positioning yourself in the shower is rough. But like the basic point here, right, is that when everything around you is mechanized, right, if everybody else is driving to get where they're going, like, can you just go ride a horse down Route 19? I mean, you could, but it would be extremely dangerous for you and the horse, right?
You would be arrested.
You would also likely be arrested, yeah. So one of the things he's pointing out, and this is actually kind of prescient in a lot of ways, like a lot of the stuff he sees his peers talking about is about individual choices, right? And what he's actually talking about here are kind of social structures and the way society is organized. And if society is organized in a particular way, right, it makes certain personal choices not viable. You can't simply choose to opt out of machine civilization when everyone else around you and everything else is opted in, right? So there's like a genuine kind of structural analysis here of society. Which is, generally speaking, the kind of thing that advanced socialists like. Now, because we started a little early, we're about out of time. We're going to be developing some more of these ideas when we talk about Auden and McNeice, who are also both, this whole generation of British writers, with a few exceptions, is largely kind of, at least kind of vaguely leftish. Although Auden and McNeice are both a little bit more genuinely individualist in their perspectives. But does anybody have any questions about this or about anything else? Everybody good? All right, then let me give you the guide questions. you are free to get on about your weekend, except for those of you who have to go down the hall to Dr. Bryant's class. You are not yet free.
I'm sorry.